Okay, in this section, we're going to be talking about the three laws that dictate success. So, the first law that I want to cover is Parkinson's law. So, it's the idea that deadlines essentially control effort. So, Parkinson's law is a mistake that I often make. When you're a founder, you have this tendency to think that everyone is motivated the same way you are. And that's exactly wrong. Most people, unfortunately, for you, are people that are going to sit in a chair and they're going to put in their 8 hours and then they're going to be done. And so if you don't give things tight deadlines, what happens is work will complicate itself to fill the available time. A person will find ways to make the job take as long as they have available to do it. And if you don't give something a deadline, you just say, hey, we got to get this done as soon as possible, then you very well could find yourself with something taking infinite hours. And so it's critical that if you're going to do it on a deadline and then make it sooner than you think it can actually be done. Because the idea is that whatever time you give something to do, you can do something in that time. Is it going to be perfect? No. Is it going to be the minimum viable that may be effective for you? Yes, maybe. So that's the key idea. Second is the law of the vital few. And this is related to Pareto's principle, that basically the idea that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. And so related to that, less is more, and finding the vital few and focusing on the vital few is key to being effective, because when you do, you use less channels, you need less people, you spend less time, and it takes less money. For example, if you just to hypothetically throw something out, right? So let's say that you're working on promoting your business and you're spending your time on all of the social networks, but you find that 80% of your business is coming from Instagram for whatever reason. So all that time you're spending in all those other channels may only be producing 20% of your results. If you focus down to just Instagram, the amount of effort that you have to do will drop dramatically, and the effects will be pretty much the same. Now, that's not a perfect case, but no matter what, right? If you have a dashboard, what are the 2 or 3 metrics that matter? And then I guess the last piece here, and it's really not written down on this slide, it's that when you're thinking about these things or what the vital few are, particularly when you're thinking about metrics, there are leading metrics, which say, okay, this happens before revenue. And then there's trailing metrics, which are rearview mirror kind of metrics. And you want to focus your vital few on the things that are leading metrics, not trailing metrics, because leading metrics help direct you where to go to get to the money. And trailing metrics help you justify why you fail. So the third law is the law of the bottleneck. So every system, regardless of how well it works, has at least one constraint that limits the performance of that system. One of your goals as a founder is to focus on the weakest link, solve it, and then move on to the next weakest link. Because after you solve a bottleneck, there's going to be another bottleneck. Another thing that's important to understand here is not to go into the system and say, okay, gosh, we have this problem and this problem and this problem. Let's go fix all 10 problems, right? Pick one, the law of the vital few, solve it. And then the equation is going to change, and prematurely solving these others may not be required anymore because they may not be where the biggest problem is. So another important kind of concept there is that when you divide your time, it takes longer to get everything done. And so if you've got a website and you know that this place is where it's failing, or you've got a system where this place is failing, fix the fail and then move on, right? Don't try to solve 10 problems at the same time. Huge mistake I've made. I continue to make it. And when I go back and I look through how to be an effective CEO, one of the things that I always go back and reflect on is what laws am I breaking and how can I correct that? So a few other startup principles I want to give you really quickly, and I'm just going to hit these fast, but I've referenced them. So the idea The magic you're looking for is in the work you're avoiding. And this is a quote, but basically it says that we tend to opt for the things that are safe. We tend to opt for the things that don't feel hard. But the magic happens when you do the things that are hard for you to do, right? So if you're a founder and you're more technical and you're like writing code, the magic probably is in you getting out there and spending a whole bunch of time with customers, right? It's hard, it's difficult, it's muscle memory you don't have, but that's where the magic is. That's where you're going to learn. That's where you're going to grow. That's where you're going to figure out things and be much more effective. The second is systems always win. So there's competing information that's out there in the market. They say start when you're a startup, do things that don't scale. That's completely true. You don't want to build the dog food factory before you know whether the dogs eat the dog food. But that said, your 1.0 should be defined in a way that it's repeatable, right? One book that I really like is called Work the System. And it's the idea that even if you're doing it yourself, you should write a little process for how you're doing something, because then you're going to refine, improve that over time. And then that's more transferable to somebody else. So systems are going to always win at the end of the day, right? You have to define that system. But once you do, you will continually refine and improve it. 3 is do more or less. This is related to the vital few, but the idea is that you need to figure out if you only could do one thing today, what's the one thing you're going to do that you're going to knock it out of the park? So do more of less. So everything you do has a task switching cost. And so you don't want to be task switching. You want to be focused on the primary things that you need to get done. And so you want to chunk your time into the most important thing first and prioritize your day so that when you have less energy, when you're losing time to task switching cost, those are smaller tasks that are happening later in the day. How I divide my time is I try to do important work in the morning, and then I try to do like meetings and other stuff in the afternoon when there's a lot of task switching involved. And that way I can get big chunks of work done the more and make sure those things are happening while still handling all the tactical that's required. Next, everything is an experiment. So no matter what you do, everything you do needs to be an experiment. You need to think of it as something that you're going to try. You want it to produce this outcome, and it may or may not. The reason for that is that you need to understand what not to do in the business as much as what to do in the business. And so everything is an experimentation. And by saying, okay, I'm going to do this effort to produce this output, we make sure that we understand when we don't produce that output, we triage why. That way everything becomes a learning process for us. Fixed time, flex scope, related to Pareto principle. But the idea is that everything should have a deadline and you have to deliver it by that deadline, right? There is no choice but to deliver it. And so if you have to flex the scope of it to make it smaller in order to deliver it, you do. And it may be that you deliver version 1 and that's not a minimum viable yet, right? And then you deliver a version 1.5 that is. You see this all the time. You see it everywhere. Every time that I'm on a Mac and every time Apple releases something, they deliver the first version, but then 2 or 3 features will show up after that, right? So they fix the time, whatever the release is going to happen, and then scope may flex on something to keep that, to make sure that the delivery happens on the date that they expect. So lastly, this one is a little bit esoteric, but unhappiness comes from a lack of coherence. So when you're not happy with how things are going, it's that something is basically inconsistent with where you want to be versus where you are now. And so figuring out where that lack of coherence is, where things are not in line, is the key to getting back to happy. And related to that, as much as you can say, okay, the straight line between here and there is the simplest, straightest path, finding that coherence, finding that piece that's out of whack with that line is super important, because otherwise you can get overwhelmed with the complexity of it all and be unhappy, but not know how to solve it. And so it comes back to the fundamentals of where do you want to go? What's the straight line between here and there? And how do I get everything in line with that straight line? And that's easier said than done, but is an important thing to think about, because if you're not happy, the company is not happy, and it means something needs to be fixed. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at AI and just a couple of tips about AI so that you can understand what we're doing with some of the prompting and stuff that we're doing, executing as we get into the tactics of building out our strategy and our offer as we move forward with the process of taking you to $100 million business. And like usual, I want to leave you with a quote. Success is not a result of chance. It's the result of choice, hard work, and following the laws of success. And so you're going to have to hustle, but if you follow best practices in terms of managing yourself and your team, the probability that you're going to get there is much higher than you think. And so I'll see you in the next lesson.